afternoon. Thank you for joining the Integrating Equity and Environmental Justice into Carbon Management Deployment panel. My name is Angela Mayer. I'm the Federal Implementation Manager for the Carbon team at GPI. My role focuses on federal funding, the resources available, as well as how funding can be implemented to reach current carbon reduction goals. A key component to the success of federal programs is the community engagement and support. Without that, these programs will most likely fail. And so this panel will focus on a discussion of the challenges and opportunities that exist for states, cities, and communities in scaling up environmental justice efforts. This panel will be moderated by Sarah Forbes, who is the Deputy Director of Carbon Management Technologies in the U.S. Department of Energy's Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management. The panel will be comprised of, Daniel Cardenas, David Monsma, and Julie Murphy. And the panel will be starting shortly. Okay, I'm gonna hand it over to Sarah now.
Can you hear me? All right. So this panel, we're going to have lots of questions for the panel and hopefully a little bit of time for the audience. But before we get started, I'm going to talk a little bit about equity and environmental justice from the federal government and specifically the DOE perspective. So to support the goal of building a clean and equitable clean energy economy, our bill-funded projects as well as our other projects are required to, first of all, support meaningful community and labor engagement. Second, to invest in America's workforce. Third, to advance diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. And fourth, to contribute to the President's goal that 40% of the overall climate benefits flow to disadvantaged communities. I'm going to talk a little bit about that, about a couple of these points. So that 40% of the benefits flowing to disadvantaged communities, that originally came from a January 27th, 2021 executive order that the President issued. And really, the administration throughout efforts has made what we call Justice 40 or J40 central to our efforts. One of the things that, and there have been a number of things that metrics and actions that have been taken administrative-wide to lead to that. For example, there was another executive order in April of this year, in 2023, which revitalized the commitment to environmental justice for all and made it clear that the executive branch agencies pursue environmental justice as a duty and that it's incorporated into our missions. So Department of Energy is one of those executive branch agencies, and environmental justice is a part of our mission. That executive order in April also directed the agencies to actively facilitate meaningful public participation and just treatment of all people in agency decision-making. The EJ scorecard was published, and an announcement was made that government-wide there are 470 programs across 19 agencies that fall under Justice 40. Our work in carbon management is part of that. And to that end, I'm not going to go into great detail in what we're doing, but I want to mention a couple of things that follow that April 2023 executive order. So we're doing some engagement. We're working with the City of Houston, Rice University, and Climate Now to plan a Carbon Management Community Summit in Houston, Texas. That will be in November. If you're interested in that, please, more details, please see me or my colleague, Mary Ellen, who's also here, and we'll be happy to talk about it. Perhaps most importantly, one of the things that we've done that's a pretty big change is we've put community benefits and community benefits plan at the center of our decisions on funding, on which projects go forward and which projects don't. So in our most recent funding opportunity announcements, those community benefits plans account for about 20% of the technical merit for a proposal. And that's a big deal. They're scored in the same way that the rest of a funding opportunity announcement is scored. And I won't go into greater detail because we have a fantastic panel, but I was asked to talk just a little bit from the DOE perspective on this environmental justice topic, and be happy to take your questions and go into greater detail in time. So what we're going to do on this panel is I'm going to give an introduction to all of the members. They're each going to spend about 3 minutes talking about their perspective on environmental justice, and then we're going to go to a series of questions, some that we prepared in advance, and hopefully some from you as well. So first we have Daniel Cardenas. Daniel is a member of the Hamawi, which I think I said incorrectly. Sorry, Daniel. Hamawi. We tried. Hamawi band of the Pit River tribe. And Daniel was also an elected member of the Pit River Tribal Council, so brings that experience. And he holds the position of CEO, president, and chairman of the board of the American Indian Infrastructure Association and the National Tribal Energy Association, both advocating for the interests of the Native American tribes across the United States. And what you don't get in reading Daniel's bio is his extensive knowledge of not only tribal concerns, but also of energy issues. Next, we have David Monsma, who's the Director of Clean Energy and Subsurface Energy Programs at the Cynthia and George Mitchell Foundation. So David directs the Clean Energy and Subsurface Energy Programs. In that role, he's responsible for the design of clean energy and subsurface energy strategies, managing the program's grant portfolio, and collaborating with grantees, partners, and alliances. David is adamant that we cannot achieve a sustainable energy future without an agreed-upon, evidence-based energy policy system in the United States, and we cannot achieve a sustainable energy policy framework in the United States without a modern and sustainable energy management system in Texas. And last but not least, Julie Murphy, who I first got to meet today but have been looking forward to for a long time, from the Colorado Energy and Carbon Management Commission. So Julie is the commission's director, and in that role, she works with Colorado's diverse oil and gas stakeholders to find common sense, consensus-based solutions. Prior to her current position as the director, she served in many different roles, including chief of staff and senior policy advisory director, and as the hearings and regulatory affairs manager. She was also an assistant attorney general representing the commission and the Department of Natural Resources in the Division of Reclamation and Mining Safety. I'll also highlight that Julie's academic background includes degrees in wildlife biology, earth and environmental resource management, law, and environmental studies and law. So thank you all for joining. This is a fantastic panel. We'll start and we'll go down. We'll go Daniel, David, and then Julie. Just a few minutes on your perspectives before we get into the questions.
So I'll just say, before I forget, that I'm probably on some watch list from the DOE because I've been asking questions about the CBP community benefits plans for a long time, constantly, having conversations with them, and then trying to hold their feet to the fire. I mean, there are friends, I work with them really closely, but I really believe that in order for the CBPs to have purpose and to really make an impact in the short time that they've been around, we need some metric. We need to sort of hold their feet to a fire about this 40% that Sarah talked about, which is just the minimum. It's a floor. It's not the max. But there's 574 federally recognized tribes, and 70% of the tribal population of these 574 tribes live in urban areas. They don't live on the reservation. And so you have a unique situation where most of those tribes, 60% of those tribes are just in Alaska and California. There's like 250 odd tribes in Alaska and 116, 17 in California. So they're very remote, very specific, but you have to have a one size fits all is not going to work for tribes and tribal communities. So you really have to tailor your projects, your programs to specific tribes. I mean, that's very difficult in these time and ages when companies want to just create a cookie cutter because it's easier. But if you know one tribe, you know only one tribe. That's sort of the message that I wanted to relay, is that when you think about community engagement with tribes, you really have to think outside the box and according to that specific community. We've seen other examples of Enbridge, TransCanada, with the XL pipeline that have slipped and fell and failed in their projects in the U.S. because they did things the way they do in Canada, which they have really good hearts with reconciliation and with a lot of different good programs. They tried to replicate that here in the U.S. and it didn't work. So I'll just stop there.
Thank you. David?
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. I was in Washington, D.C. in 1994 when the first executive order, 12898, I'll never forget it, was signed for environmental justice in the Clinton administration. I worked for an environmental group called Environmental Action, and these were in the days when Carol Browner was convening the Common Sense Initiative. It was a sector-based initiative, but it included environmental community, the national groups, EDF, NRDC, Sierra Club. Mike McCloskey, I think, helped support that from the environmental perspective. But there was also environmental justice. That's when I was reminded, Bernice Miller is here. I haven't seen you in a long time, but that's when we met. Robert Bullard, Ben Chavis, Beverly Wright all came to Washington, D.C., and there was a dialogue on how are we going to manage pollution in these different sectors at the advent of kind of climate change. Toxics was still an issue. It's an issue now, but it was probably the predominant one more than climate back then. So I have an opportunity to finish that work some 30-some years later here working at the Mitchell Foundation, because we still have a dialogue that isn't complete. And one of the things that I've noticed in carbon management and trying to understand the Texas landscape, there are various communities. Texas is big, so West Texas doesn't look like East Houston, and there are a number of different community perspectives on work, labor, the environment, and health, but there's not a dialogue. Part of the communities have opted out of the carbon management discussion, and so we've got to bring that dialogue back together, and I'm here to think and talk about that with anybody who wants to.
Thank you. Julie?
Great. Thank you all. Thank you all for bearing with us through the late stages of a long and very productive, thoughtful day. I'm the director of Colorado's Energy and Carbon Management Commission, which came into being on July 1st of this year. So before that, I was the director of Colorado's Oil and Gas Conservation Commission, our regulatory body for oil and gas. I would say on the topic of environmental justice, to say that there are many learnings left is an understatement, and it's something that we are continuing to do every day. I think that the thoughts and tools from today, especially around community engagement and working with labor, are particularly constructive. And I would echo what I've heard around it needs to be a conversation, not education. We need to start before the project. I think that that's something that I've certainly experienced in the oil and gas sector, is that if you already have the project on a map somewhere, you've foreshortened and perhaps undermined community engagement. I am proud of the work of our organization. In 2020, we passed the first environmental justice regulations for a state regulatory body in Colorado. And it was occurring about the same time that legislation was passed in Colorado requiring environmental justice consideration in all state decision-making and arenas. So now we are working to morph what is coming out of that legislative work and a statewide environmental justice task or board into our work within my organization. And as I think about J40, I think it's early for states or for state organizations to have a strong directive about how we're going to implement it. But for me, the opportunity that I see is a little bit to echo what Daniel acknowledged, in that it could be a platform through which we could look at the collective benefit across the US. We each have our own way of doing things. Each community is different, but how do we look at the macro and what we can accomplish? So with that, I'll turn it back to you, Sarah.
Thank you. Actually, Julie, I'm going to ask you the first question. So, can you tell us about how carbon management work has evolved over the years in the state of Colorado? Discuss the origin of your center and how you've worked to center equity in the communities in the commission's work. So stakeholder, anything relevant. I mean, you just pointed to it a little bit, but a little more depth.
I would be happy to. So I think at the Oil and Gas Commission, again, we took a step into the arena of trying to have both procedural and substantive requirements that considered the voice of impacted communities and encourage citing away from disproportionately impacted communities. And I think that work has been profound. I would say we have a lot of work left to do in terms of actually finding community connectors to hear from the community, right? It's still a bit of a blank slate, and that means our work is very far from done in that arena. And so that's kind of the shaping that we have been through over the last couple of years at the oil and gas side. And kind of concurrently with that, we were beginning to explore the opportunity to take over primacy for Class 6 carbon sequestration wells. My organization is already the implementer for Class 2 wells for oil E&P waste, and wanted to expand the state's role in managing carbon and managing our own process. So we started looking hard at this, and what's been most interesting to me is that as we have tried to pursue authority from our legislature on carbon sequestration, it brought out all of these oil and gas adjacent industries and opportunities that, to me, going back to the conversation that I think the labor team set up so beautifully, is that how do we repurpose our expertise? How do we continue to evolve? How do we transform our communities and provide long-term trajectories for different skill sets? I think that was very nicely articulated. It's what I saw from my team, right? As we're seeing changes in the oil and gas industry, how can we look at gas storage? How can we look at Class 6 wells? How can we look at deep geothermal? Those are our additional areas of expertise. And make sure that Colorado has a unified perspective about how we're developing the subsurface. So that's kind of the big picture. But as we were moving through to integrate and expand our authority, the biggest challenge was really this intersection between our macro climate goals that are global with the micro community needs. And again, I would articulate that we haven't found the right set of tools or engagement, and I think it's because it's community specific, to be able to have the community voice. But we had so many people at the table saying, it's great that y'all want to do this. How are you going to engage community? How are you going to protect community? And I would articulate that it's difficult to do that at the legislative level. That is so project specific, community specific, that we've had to manage a number of things, but we have very strong statutory safeguards around disproportionately impacted community engagement as a result of that dialogue. Again, we are continuing to work on this. I think I've left here today with additional tools and contacts for human beings who can help us continue this work, but it is an unfolding work, and I think we're at the nascent stages of it, both on carbon management and community engagement.
Thank you, Julie. David, what can carbon management stakeholders, including industry, governments, and community members, do to meaningfully embed equity principles into the way they do business or the way they engage with each other?
It's a great question. Let me know when you have the answer. Daniel, I think I'm probably on your watch list at DOE too. I've been bugging them through the MPC study on hydrogen, and my colleague Mary Lou Hastings is on the greenhouse gas task or study on the societal considerations impacts study groups, and Miran and Jose I've been working with them, happy to have met them. And that's a question we've been struggling with for the last, it's almost a year now, I think. And we've been bugging DOE about its formulation, its interpretation of Justice 40, of equity in terms of how they're going to evaluate and weight it. I have to say this, DOE has been handed a very, very hard job, and I think they rarely get praise. I commend them for taking on this goal of trying to transform energy development by including a much deeper and a much more transformative version of community engagement than your uncle's community advisory panel from 25 years ago. And I think that that's a tall order. It has a lot of critics. There are some aspects about fossil fuels energy transition that are not acceptable to certain communities. And so despite all their good efforts, there's still an there's a dialogue that hasn't happened, as I said earlier. So there's this hard part that the White House and the DOE and EPA and the other federal agencies have been having, a road they've been having to hoe, and that is you need to implement Justice 40 in your covered programs. You noted how many there are. There are many. We have a historic level of funding to assist in that process. We're going to help you define disadvantaged communities, at least at some practical level, with some mapping. And there are other tools that we have available, and we're willing to listen to you. And we've tried to do outreach to be able to inform that process. But it's incomplete. It's incomplete because some of the frontline communities and some of the fence line communities do not see the energy transition as sustainable, that the energy technologies that we're talking about and the carbon captures systems and hydrogen possibilities for carbon management are not acceptable for that community. So that's something that requires industry, government, and environmental community to change the discourse, to somehow meet that community halfway. And so I think we all have a responsibility to do that, and the first part of it is accepting or acknowledging that that's the case. I think many people I talk to know that there's a chasm there, but it's not often spoken about in gatherings like this. And so while there is many things that DOE needs to do, and I think they're trying to do much of them, the premise for your question about the different sectors, corporate, government, and maybe state, and then NGOs, what we noticed in our task group was that those roles aren't very well defined. Those roles, what is the role of DOE? What is the role of the state government? What is the role of NGOs or academics? I think many communities in this sector, in this broad set of sectors, I should say, don't necessarily understand the technology. So where there's some provocative opposition, negative opposition to LNG and different types of advancements in energy technology that might have co-environment benefits, might have health benefits, those communities are looking to understand, but I've talked to people in Northeast Houston who said no one has explained. I do not know what CCS is. I do not know what hydrogen fuels are. No one has talked to me about that. In a state that has lots of academic resources and lots of community organizations. So there's something wrong with this picture, and we've got to fix it, and I think the DOE is doing their role. I think there may be some of us that have something more to offer and need to do.
Thank you. Despite the fact that you used words like unacceptable and chasm, you are understated in the challenge and in the work ahead, which we'll get to in a minute. So Daniel, we've talked about, your change in thinking on Justice 40, and I'd like to ask you about how do we think long term and look forward to durable political coalitions so that disadvantaged communities and the tribes specifically can continue to benefit from climate investments.
Like you mentioned, Sarah, is initially I wasn't a fan of Justice 40. Like I said, I was probably the biggest enemy to Justice 40. But when I actually start talking with folks like Sarah and different colleagues of hers at DOE, the White House, other places, I became the biggest fan. And continue to this day to be the biggest fan. Even to the point, like I said, of being on this watch list with DOE, because it's so important to me that it transcend the different administrations. Obviously, that's probably not going to happen who knows what's going to happen over the next year or two in terms of keeping the momentum around Justice 40. And so really the ball needs to be passed to the states. That would be my suggestion, is that for us as tribes, obviously the federal government is our trustee in a way. There's a trust responsibility for the tribes that exists with no other group in the United States, no other ethnic group, no other political group, or even the states. It's a very unique relationship that we have. That's why I say, every inch of this country is Indian country. And by us, historically, however you see that, giving up the sovereignty over those lands, that's the price we paid. But the benefit, if you see it that way, is this trust relationship that they have responsibility for us in terms of making sure that our best interests are taken care of. That doesn't always happen, obviously, but I think if the states and the private sector would latch on to the community benefits plan or this idea that's Justice 40, it's doing the right thing after who knows however long. It's actually starting to do the right thing, whether it's in regulation, whether it's in legislation, whether the bully pulpit that these governors have, and the private sector, not just the NGOs, but also the corporate side. There's a lot of ways that in conjunction with tribes, right? I'm a big believer in procurement. I know there's an attack right now on minority procurement at the Supreme Court, starting with the minority college admissions, and now they're moving into attacking procurement programs at the private sector level. But if that can be, somehow if we can move beyond that, and if the states and the private sector can really get behind implementing, buying services and products from minorities, not just tribes, but all the minority groups, that strengthens our community, especially the tribal community. And so I'd say that because the tribes have this unique relationship with the feds, and because tribal issues at the congressional level on the Hill, for the most part, are bipartisan or nonpartisan. We have friends on both sides of the aisle, and so come to us, work with us when it's not just on the Justice 40, but on CCUS and carbon issues. A lot of times are demonized in DC, or on one side or the other political spectrum, as we're seeing with the IRA. Even though it may not have gotten a lot of Republican votes, many of those politicians are in their districts, in their states, are seeing the benefits of the IRA already, even though it hasn't even rolled out completely. And so there's a lot of friends for it. And so I'd say, to answer your question, is use us as a key partner to go to our friends on the Hill to roll in support for not just renewable energy and CCUS, but Justice 40. And I'll leave it with this, like David had said, is that our community, we weren't part of a dialogue. Nobody asked us at the table about the energy transition. I don't even use the term energy transition. I use the term energy evolution. The uses of energy are evolving, not transitioning. And so, but nobody asked us. If some group, whether it was consensus politically, said this is a great idea. I'm not anti-energy transition. I'm all of the above approach to energy production. Since we weren't asked to be part of this dialogue, even though it's a good idea, as we move forward into critical minerals and other aspects or facets of energy transition, we're continually being asked to, as communities, because like I said, our trade association represents the 4 largest energy-producing tribes in the country, and those are fossil energy tribes. They produce 90% of the BTUs that are produced in Indian country: coal, oil, natural gas, all the bad words nowadays. That's our bread and butter, or for those tribes, and so we've been asked to sacrifice for the common good, to make have a cleaner environment. Like I said, I always say we're always the last invited to the dinner and the first and asked to leave. It's like, let us stay a couple of courses. You guys leave first. Let us sit at the table a little bit more and gain some wealth. And one of my business partners says that represents the Crow tribe. They're the largest coal-producing tribe in the country outside the federal government. They're the largest coal owners in this country. He's like, we have to mine coal to get out of coal, and so give us a little bit, a little bit more time to eat at the table while the rest of you sacrifice for the common good.
Thank you. Having a seat at the table is important, and I'm hearing that it's maybe just the first step too. The next question is for Julie, and we're going to talk about, again, turn back to the state perspective. What proactive steps is the state of Colorado taking to ensure that the federal investments for carbon management translate into tangible benefits for both communities and for sovereign nations?
I think that's a great question, and as I alluded to in the Justice 40 framework, I think we need to let the federal process move along a little bit further until it's truly in the state hands. But I hear the opportunity that Daniel has articulated around how do we create durability around it and kind of enshrine it. And I think that it complements and harnesses the work that the state of Colorado has started with its, I think it's 1242, I can't remember the bill title right now, but from 2019 that created an environmental justice advisory board that again has kind of set the definition across the state of Colorado. And I see these two frameworks working together to help us define, measure success. Again, it's a floor, not a ceiling when it comes to the 40%, but also to help us understand across all of our agencies what success looks like. It's something that I'm integrating into our conversations with our Orphan Well program, which is working on funding from IIJA to reduce the orphan wells across the state of Colorado. We are working with BLM, and we've had a very preliminary conversation with the Southern Utes about helping facilitate plugging of wells on the reservation as well. Again, those are conversations where I see the state being a partner to support, but not dictating an outcome. And so again, I think that this really is a framework. The state of Colorado also has something called EnviroScreen that our Department of Public Health put together that helps us look at across the state where are places where we should be avoiding adding additional impacts, where are places that are less bad, for lack of a better term, when we're looking at developing new industry. And so we can see that framework. And then the complementary piece, again, is how do we get the community connectors? How do we get engaged with the local community as well to hear their perspective? I can't help but think that there's also opportunity when I think about carbon management. Most of the local government folks that I talk to are freaked out, might be an understatement, but is there an opportunity to put together a model framework for local governments so that they can have a tool when their constituents come to them and say, what are we going to do in this space? How are we going to participate? How are you going to represent our community to help empower them to look at and think about what it can look like? So those are some pieces. Again, I think we're at the nascent stages.
Thank you. So I'm going to ask David one more question and Daniel one more question, and a question for everyone. I know we're going a little bit over, but I don't want to lose the expertise on the panel and cut it too short. So David, can you discuss the significance of community-centered approaches, including community benefits in carbon management projects?
I can. I don't think I can be comprehensive.
Okay.
There are a lot of good examples, but I think we're in a new era. I do put a lot of weight on the word transformative about community engagement. I hope we're all thinking about a different level. I know for the regulated community, it's difficult. They have a history and an internal practice of best practices of plan, do, check, act. And environmental justice and equity doesn't fit neatly into that type of, what you might have called total quality management or Sigma 6 as a part of your management process. But there are models emerging, and if you will, I'll show you one. It's on, I have a kind of prototype that we received, if you're able to put it up on the screen. Anyway.
I'll see if I can do it. It's up.
Oh, there we go. This is a model. It's hard to read, I think, probably, and it looks like, something that maybe you don't want it to understand. But when the concept of hydrogen hubs came about, and we've heard here about carbon hubs, there's a need for community benefit hubs. That is, there are multiple communities seeking multiple benefits at the same time for multiple purposes. They're not all seeking one form of technical or restorative justice or procedural justice. They're also looking for resources, but for different reasons maybe than the developers of projects. And so we don't really have good examples of that where equity or environmental justice principles are built in. They're not embedded in a lot of environmental management systems that companies use to run large operations. We've seen the advent of diversity and inclusion and equity, but when it comes to actual communities, it's still very difficult. And you tend to rely on consultants, and you have internal pressures that really require performance results, and they're on a time scale. And community benefit development doesn't really work on that same scale. So we were, one of our partners at the Mitchell Foundation is the Houston Advanced Research Center in Houston called HARC. And HARC was also thinking about this and talking to communities. And they just developed, based on a University of Texas professor, a kind of model that said, look, you're going to have to think about multiple communities. They need a system. The local county or city government isn't going to help them necessarily perform this. The state of Texas may or may not even know what to do. And so as you're thinking about communities, you have to think about more than one community. You have to think about dozens of communities, and their individual interests are informed by their local experience. Some of them are frontline communities, and some of them aren't. Some of them are on the fence line, some of them are very distant from it, but work in the facilities where we're going to see carbon management express itself. They need a way to interact with the regulated community, with industry, and that's not always. Separating those communities and working those discussions one-off is maybe not the healthiest thing, especially so communities can see that they may have common interests with a community that they don't know on the other side of a municipality or of a state, and that might provide some ability for them to find common interests, to find funding streams that they share. They may not have the capacity to receive certain federal funding, so there may be an entity that they can know as a part of being a part of a hub. Similarly, on the regulated side, on industry side, they're equally kind of at a loss sometimes. They're very competitive. They all think they do community engagement pretty well. We know that they don't always. It's a high hurdle for them to understand what Justice 40 or what their community benefit plan is going to look like, and they need to be involved in that type of discussion. What's missing here is a trusted broker, a trusted messenger. The trust is broken. There are no trusted messengers right now for some of these communities. For others, they just want to be treated differently. We've done some focus groups in Texas, and what we noticed the most is that if you take much more time to respect the fact they work during the day, and that they need to eat in the evening, and that they don't have a lot of time for this type of thing. But if you offer a little more depth in your discussion, in your engagement, and they trust the third party who's convening to moderate that, It's not an industry person. It's not necessarily an NGO, an environmental NGO, or a climate justice advocate. It's somebody who's just there to understand what their perspective is, possibly on some development. That if that's a deeper level, they respond a little more differently than they do in some of the more typical forms of community engagement. But it does have to be sustained, deeper, a better commitment to that process. That's timely. That doesn't fit in with a lot of our timescales right now in terms of both politics and for projects that are underway. So that's the trade-off. We have to think about how much time can we afford for this type of approach. But it's just a model to think about.
Thank you, David. Daniel, how can we ensure that the interests and needs of local communities and tribes are at the forefront? How should community benefit plans be tailored uniquely for distinct communities? And specifically, how should approaches differ for engagement with sovereign nations compared to local governments?
Well, I'd say to keep it quick is we need to work with the DOE. So DOE is one of the, as you know, one of the agencies that is the main agency that's moving many of these programs so far, right? Some of the other agencies are starting to come out with stuff. EPA is one, but I'd say hopefully if we have time before the administration's change is, many of those I know many of those CBPs aren't public information. They're part of these applications that are going through to the DOE. So DOE has them and knows what's in them, right? And if you haven't read a FOIA or any of the documents, you wouldn't even have any idea about what the DOE is requiring for the CBPs. And so I'd say there needs some more transparency around what's actually in them. And a lot of our communities don't even know because, like I said, because what David had mentioned before is a lot of the process to write the proposal is so short. Some of them are 30 days, 45, 60 is probably the longest. Some of them are even longer, but really some of these timeframes are so short. And you mentioned that the CBP needs a discussion that's longer than the 30 or 60 days that we're given. So, so I don't want to complain about the I don't know the word, but how good the CBPs are, because if I had my gut, I'm not a betting man, but if I would make a bet, I'd say 70 to 80% of the CBPs that DOE's getting are going to be almost like cookie cutter the same, because what happens is there's a whole crop of consultants. I don't know how there's CBP experts now because it's just such a new thing, but there are people that are calling themselves experts in this. I'm not an expert in anything, but I do know that there's no CBP experts. But they're advising and getting paid big bucks to write these CBPs, and basically they're the same. And I use one example. I was helping on the hydrogen hub, an application of one group, some states that were doing the hydrogen hub application, and the same consultant was consulting another group of states, and they're the same CBP, and so, and I've seen this in my own eyes, and so it was I was just amazed. So to answer your question, I think that we really, for our tribes, like I said, there's 574 tribes. That means there's going to be way more than 574 CBPs because a lot of our tribes, there are various communities on one reservation. Where I live, on the Wind River Reservation in Wyoming, there's at least 4 or 5 distinct communities, like I said, each with different, all from the same tribe, but different needs and wants, and so you just multiply that over all the reservations, and then all the urban communities, urban natives that live here in Albuquerque, Santa Fe. There's a bunch of tribal people that how do you deal with those guys too, that are off the reservation, and so it's very complex. I just say that I like what David said having a CBP hub for the long term, so that we can start talking about what does that mean, not just for federal funding, but if that goes away, what does that mean for state projects? What does that mean for private sector? What does that mean for corporations that want to act right, and will do the CBPs even if it's more. It's not really a cost thing. It's just you should be doing it anyways. And like you said, there's the new way of community. You know, his question was about community-centered dialogue, and you know, we're looking at how specifically in critical minerals, but the new mine, the mine of the future, and with our partners at the Colorado School of Mines. And part of that is, how do we do community engagement at the beginning? How do we center that engagement? How do we create community-centered consent? People call it social license, but really it's taking an adversarial NEPA or an environmental process and making it community-oriented when it's a win-win for all of us. And that coincides with how tribes operate. Is a lot of tribes operate by consensus. It's not by majority vote. It's like once everybody agrees to something, that's the plan. And so our way of doing carbon management, our way of doing big infrastructure, transmission, pipelines, everything that's needed for this energy transition, we really need to look at community-centered approaches where it's a win-win rather than the project developer versus community. So,
thank you, Daniel. So I'm getting the signal that we need to close it out. I want to leave with just a closing thought. In this panel, I heard a number of key things. You know, the importance of centering equity and justice in all of our actions. The fact that, you know, communities or tribes, as well as business, governments, federal and state, all have a role to play in the bucket of engagement and in furthering justice, and that we all still have a lot of questions about how to do better. There's one thing that didn't come up that I'll leave, and that is, you know, as we move forward, really making sure that in advance of any engagement with communities, that information is provided regarding the risks and the benefits, regarding any mitigation to environmental impacts, and really, you know, just really doing due diligence. With that, thank you all for your attention. I am sorry we went over, but let's give the panel a final round of applause.
All right, thank you, Sarah, Daniel, David, Julie. We really appreciate it. I'm going to wrap us up here. Just want to thank all of our speakers today for their time and their expertise and insight, and thank the audience as well for your enthusiasm and your questions. We have a dinner this evening that starts at 6:30. You can join us at the Cottonwoods Pavilion and Patio, which is a beautiful, like 7 to 10 minute walk down the walking path here. We're also going to have shuttles that can take you down there if you'd prefer to take a shuttle. Those will start at 6:25, and you can catch those out by the carriage circle. So if you look out, you're at the Rio Lounge. You look out, there's a little carriage with a turnaround, and that's where the shuttles will be. And those will be going continuously until everyone gets down there. And I will say, we start at 6:30. We'll just have a reception. People can come, mingle, grab a drink. But we will be taking dinner orders at 7. So make sure you're there by 7 so you don't have to wait to get your food. I think that is all I have. I'm going to make one final plug for our feedback charts and the Jamboard link. There's one lone Post-it note out there, so thank you to whoever did that. And I would encourage all of you to write down a single thought and put it on the Post-it note and give us something to talk about at the end of the conference. So thank you all for everything today, and we'll see you at the dinner.